Okay, thanks, Jeanette. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Leanne Chuboff, and I am the Vice President of Technical Affairs at SQF. This version of Edition 8 overview is specific to feed and pet food. So what I will be reviewing with you today are just a basic overview of SQF, where our certificates are and everything, and then go into the specific details for the changes to Edition 8 for feed and pet food. Okay, so what I'm going to do is start out with SQF by the numbers and just give you an overview of where we are today. So within SQF, our certificates, our basic overview really hasn't changed much. United States is our main market, Australia second, Canada third, Japan fourth, and Mexico third. Those are our 5 key countries that we are focused in. We also have a handful of certificates in Taiwan, as well as some other Latin American countries like Brazil and Chile as our other areas of focus. Certificate growth, I kind of wanted to share this with you all. The certificates, this is for Edition 7.2. Areas that we are focused on is FSC 1, which would be the growing of feed, and then FSC 34 and 32, which is feed and pet food. So there is a lot of growth in these areas, as well as that unknown category, which is the safe feed, safe food, which is what we administer through SQF in our database system. I also wanted to share with you those top non-conformances for the food sector categories that are applicable to you guys. So FSC 2, 32, and 34. The top minor, major, and OIPs, there weren't any critical non-conformities, but I wanted to share with you what those top issues were that our auditors have been seeing among these food sector categories. So the food safety plan that isn't being controlled or documented, as well as foreign material contamination and programs that are in place for controlling foreign material. And of course, there's always cleaning and sanitation, record validation, business continuity. But I also wanted to share those specific areas about those compliant. And one thing that I wanted to highlight here is that those items that are also in compliant is what we look at. So management policy and management responsibility are the most frequently in compliant items. So I'm not saying that we need to mark these non-compliant or the minors should be compliant, but it's just statistics and data that we like to share, and it might be something that you would be looking at as well. Also, average score for these food sector categories is a 94.8. Average score among all of our SQF certified sites is a 93.4. So these food sector categories are a little bit higher than average. Okay, so let's get into why you're here, which is all about Edition 8. And so before we begin, I do want to share with you our specific goals with Edition 8 so that you can understand where we were coming from and why we developed and designed the way that we did. So we had 4 goals working into Edition 8. Number 1, we wanted to look at the food safety and quality codes to look at the specific needs of the operation in the industry sector, that specific industry sector. So with 7.2, we had 1 system element that was supposed to fit all of our industry scopes, to fit primary, storage and distribution, food packaging, as well as manufacturing, and then a quality code that was integrated with the food safety code. So we wanted to redesign these food safety and quality codes to specifically fit the operation in the industry sector. And then we also wanted to make sure that we included all those good industry practices, like your GMPs and the GAPs, as well as those food safety, the emerging food safety issues, those that we see from recalls, and then regulatory requirements. So we see some of those things, especially through FSMA, and we wanted to take what was those key components for food safety and incorporate them into our Edition 8. Next, we wanted to look at those quality elements and put pretty much the quality back in the quality code. What we had with 7.2 was quality integrated with food safety, and the focus always was on food safety. That's not a bad thing, but the expectation sorry about that, the expectation for the suppliers was something different, or for your buyers was something different. So those buyers were really expecting sites that were level 3 to meet a higher level, and our code just wasn't hitting that mark. And so we wanted to build out those quality components and then include more emphasis on management responsibility, more emphasis on process variation, controlling process variation, and then also continuous improvement. And then, of course, we had to include the benchmarking requirements that were outlined in version 7 through GFSI. So what we had is one code for every industry sector, and we split it out now into 7 different codes among 5 different industry scopes. So we have our level 1 program, which is our food safety fundamentals, that is still, won't be benchmarked to GFSI. It's for those small and local suppliers that are trying to understand the entire food safety and certification process. Then our level 2 is specific to food safety, and we have 5 different food safety codes: manufacturing, primary, storage and distribution, manufacturer of food packaging, and then our retail code. What you all will be focusing on today is the SQF code for manufacturing. And then the quality code is our level 3 program, and our quality code is just specific to quality. The only codes that will be benchmarked to GFSI are the food safety codes. Level 1 doesn't include a HACCP component, therefore it won't be benchmarked. It doesn't meet those requirements. And then level 3 is all on quality, and GFSI does not benchmark anything outside of food safety. So a question came in and said, is Edition 8 fully in line with the preventive controls rules for animal foods? And that's a great question, and actually I don't know the answer. That's something that we will have to do a quick gap assessment and understand if it's fully in line with the animal foods, and I'm not sure if it is or not. I know we did it to produce, I know we did it to food safety. I'm pretty sure we're in line with it, but I don't know. So we reached out to Henry Turlington when we were building the feed and the feed code, and he provided me some guidance. So I think we are, but we have to do a double check on that. I cannot confirm that we are. So let's focus on the food safety code for manufacturing. That's where animal feed and pet food is housed. So the food safety code for manufacturing, it is a separate Part A and system elements. It covers produce, pack houses, slaughterhouses, and the manufacture of animal feed and pet food, which would be your 34 and 32, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So the GMP module specifically for you would be Module 11, and of course this will be submitted to GFSI for benchmarking. So let's get into the details. We only have about an hour to go through, and there's quite a lot of details, and I'm sure you have questions. So let's get into these changes. Let's talk about Part A first. So Part A is the part that we never really focus on. Part A is the code methodology. It talks about how scoring is calculated. It talks about suspensions protocols and what you need to do in order to maintain your SQF certification. So we made some changes to Part A. First off, we added a requirement for all operational and cleaning shifts, and pre-operational inspections need to be conducted where applicable. And that means that if a site normally goes through a pre-operation, like a pre-op, then we want the auditor to take a look at that pre-op experience. Our focus isn't just going to be on first shift. What we'd like to make sure is that the auditor is looking at all shifts so that we're getting a good sense of the food safety practices at all shifts. Now, if the site traditionally doesn't have a pre-op, we're not requiring sites to all of a sudden include a pre-op component. So there are some sites, and I can't speak for feed or pet food really, but there are some sites that they do dry blending, and there is just no pre-op. It's just continuous operation, or it's, you know, there might be a break in the production, but there's no pre-op. And so we're not mandating that every site have a pre-op. What we're saying is that if the site does have a pre-op, we want the auditor to evaluate that pre-op. Second is that we did include an option for corporate audits. And what does that mean? It means that the site and the certification body can agree to have a document review conducted at the corporation, the corporate site. Oftentimes for a corporate site, they have one site that manages a lot of the programs, the development and the enhancement and the continuous improvement of programs such as the recall program or product development, business continuity, approved suppliers. Often that's managed at the corporate site. And then it's trickled down at the SQF certified sites. So what we're saying is, instead of, if there's 10 sites that feed up into one corporate that do all these programs and program development and review for them, then you can have one document review at that corporate site and have it applied to all 10 sites. So what needs to happen is that the certification body and the site need to agree. The site needs to ask for the CB's corporate audit protocol in order to understand what is the expectations from the site, what's the expectation from the auditor, how is the information shared down to each of the site levels. So that is just an option, it's not a requirement. So I do want to emphasize that as well. So we have a couple mandatory elements, and this is where I'm getting a lot of questions from feed and allergen, or feed and pet food folks, especially as it relates to the new mandatory element for allergen management. So complaint management, all scopes, it's now a mandatory requirement, which makes perfect sense for everybody. But the allergen management, it is included in mandatory for manufacturing, feed, and storage and distribution and manufacture of food packaging. It is not mandatory. I'm sorry, I meant pet food, not feed. It's not mandatory for feed. It's only mandatory for pet food. But when we get to that component, I'll explain a little bit more what we're looking for when it comes to the mandatory requirement for pet food. It's different than the mandatory requirement for manufacturing or storage and distribution or food packaging. So we'll talk about that a little bit, but it's not mandatory for feed. We also changed the corrective action closeout time frame. So now both minors and majors are closed out in 30 days, and we removed OIPs as a response. So no longer can that be used as a response. It has to be minor, major, critical, or compliant, NA, or exempt. We did change up the unannounced audit protocol. What we did and what we looked at, so there were statistics and the data showed that there were no change in scores, or there was no change in the top nonconformances, and there was no issues or complaints. So really, why are we continuing with unannounced audits if it's not making a big difference? But what we've heard anecdotally is that there is a change in management commitment. SQF practitioners love the unannounced audit because the focus is on the audit, because nobody knows when it's happening. So what we wanted to do is, how can we make every year an unannounced audit year? And we thought, well, why not do that voluntary? So we added protocols so any site can volunteer to have an annual unannounced audit. It's for those full duration, those 3 certification cycles. And instead of the stick, meaning the mandate of it, we provided the carrot, which means what we want to do is recognize those sites that actually volunteer to go through unannounced audit for every single recertification. And so with that, we have posed an SQF select site, and that's what the certificate will show, is that any site that volunteers to go through an unannounced audit every single year will have select site posted on their certificate, and their buyer will understand that they are going through an unannounced audit every year. So again, we're looking at the carrot versus the stick on this one. There were some changes following suspensions as well as withdrawn. So if a site has been suspended, what we have deemed it is that those surveillance audits, so the 6-month surveillance audit, is unannounced. But that's only if it's following a suspension. If it's under a C comply because of a surveillance audit due to a rating, it is not unannounced. It will be an announced audit. So surveillance audits following a suspension are now unannounced. Withdrawn sites, that was enacted last year, but if a site has been withdrawn, it's posted to SQFI.com for 12 months, and the site has a 12-month waiting period that has been implemented before they can reapply for certification. We added a whole new section on compliance, and basically this is just stating, requesting that the site allow validation or witness audits or shadow audits to occur so that we can focus on auditor compliance and competence. And what we also are saying in this compliance section is that when these activities occur, there should be no unjust, or there shouldn't be any change in the audit score or the audit process. There shouldn't be change in there more time or more money or a different outcome. And so that's what we added in there. We also defined requirements for technical experts. So when a technical expert is used, they basically have to have the same requirements as an auditor, except for the audit experience, obviously. And then we redesigned the food sector categories. For us, this was a clear identification for that kind of chunked up the industry a little bit better for us. And the areas that for feed and pet food that are most applicable is FSC 2. So what we did with FSC 2, which used to be growing and harvesting of animal feeds, we combined that with FSC 34. And so now FSC 34 is the manufacturing as well as the growing and harvesting of animal feeds. So that does include everything now. So FSC 2 is now in with FSC 34. And the other area is FSC 32, which is pet food, and there was no change in FSC 32. Okay, so let's go into the manufacturing and those system elements, the key changes. So the system elements that you know is those system elements are what we call Module 2. And in Module 2, there were a handful, maybe about 20 different changes, including like just basic wordsmithing changes. And I'm going to go over the highlights to those changes right now in those system elements. So the first change was in the senior site management. And what we wanted to add is how is senior site management involved when there is a change, a significant change in personnel or a significant change in the process, and how will these changes or won't they affect the overall day-to-day operation. So basically it's change management without having an official change management policy documented and reviewed, et cetera. So basically what the auditor will be looking for is if there were any changes to the process and if there was any ill effect because of those changes because it wasn't managed properly. But that's 21210. Second off is the blackout dates. So for that unannounced audit protocol that I mentioned, there are defined blackout dates. And those blackout dates can be defined by the site due to processing or business operation. We say processing isn't scheduled or production isn't scheduled. So we're product specific, meaning the auditor needs to see the product being made. We can't just go in there on your day off or when maintenance is working on equipment or you don't have product in. What we're asking is that the site identify these blackout dates and communicate that to the certification body so that they won't schedule an audit during this time. And in some cases, what we've found is that these blackout dates were because the SQF practitioner was on vacation or the plant manager wasn't available or whatever it might be that somehow could have demonstrated that the site wasn't fully ready unless this person was there. And so since the site operates when that person isn't there anyways, and that site, it needs to be responsible for food safety with or without that person, we don't deem that as an acceptable blackout date. So what we want our auditors to take a look and validate that these blackout dates that the site has identified are indeed valid, and that's what the auditor will do. And now it's auditable and could be a non-conformance. We did add another couple management commitment. One we added is that the SQF practitioner has to update senior site management on a monthly basis on matters that are impacting the implementation and maintenance of the SQF system. What we want is, now it has to be documented, so the updates and the management responses have to be updated. So when the site says, when the conversation happens, it could be via email, it could be via the phone, it could be via Skype. It's not a meeting, it's an update. And the gist of it is that the SQF practitioner is making the plant manager aware that there are some food safety challenges, opportunities, issues, whatever you want to call them, and that there is going to be a response from senior site management. So a couple points of emphasis is, one, we're looking at the senior site management. It's not just the senior manager at the corporation. So we're not looking at the CEO or anything. It's at the site. Who's the senior most person in charge? And then also that it's an update. So we're not thinking that it's a face-to-face, a weekly meeting, you know, all of that. It does have to be documented, and that's what the auditor will look for. And then basically we looked at business continuity and changed the terminology to crisis management. But basically it's pretty much the same as what you've always had. In document controls, we added here that the food safety policy and the management system is now under records. It used to be under management responsibility, and we put it under records now. We clarified some of it. We updated some of it so that it's emphasis on food safety procedures, good industry practices, food safety plans, etc. We wanted to make sure that it included all aspects of the SQF system. So oftentimes food fraud, food defense isn't considered food safety, but it's part of the SQF system, and that's what needs to be included. We also added to records that and clarified that any changes, basically the SQF system is validated and or justified. So depending on the nature of what you're updating or any changes, sometimes validation activities just can't occur, but the justification would be a better fit. Specification and product development 2.3. We added and updated a couple things and also clarified some things. So for 2322, we just updated that for 2322, it's the relevant legislation in the country of manufacture, which was in there, as well as the country of destination if known. And then we clarified and corrected a lot of these verification versus validation. So we used to say validation of raw materials, and that just wasn't appropriate. And same thing with the packaging materials. It all said validation, and it should have been verification, so we corrected that. And we clarified with the product labels that our emphasis is on the finished product labels and not all of those labels that are used within the operation, or the appropriate labels specifically. And then specifications for contract services, we wanted to clarify that it's those specifications that have an impact on product safety. We were getting questions as to whether the plumber needed to be listed as a contract service provider. And again, if it has an impact on product safety, then yes, it does need to be listed. For the food safety plan, this seems like it was the biggest change without having the biggest change. So 2.4.3.1 used to be its own single requirement for HACCP. And it still is HACCP following Codex. That's the requirement. We had to take out NACMIS because that's not in GFSI anymore. So GFSI removed the reference to NACMIS, and that's why it's removed from SQF. So basically, it's Codex. And the food safety plan is now all the way to 24317. And 2.4.3.1 all the way through 2.4.3.16 basically is just Codex, but spelled out into these different steps or into these different requirements. So the steps and principles of Codex are intertwined into those specific requirements in 2.431 all the way to 16. Now 24317 is in reference to food safety regulations in the country of production if there is a different food safety control methodology other than Codex. So FSMA, for example, has a written food safety plan that's required in the preventive controls. And so what we added in here is basically if there is another prescribed methodology, then that also has to be conducted. But what we're not saying is that you need to have two separate food safety plans. What we're saying is that they can be combined, but both need to be followed. So the biggest question I get is, does the written food safety plan meet the requirements of Codex HACCP? And if it's designed to meet the requirements of Codex HACCP, then it would be okay and it would meet the SQF requirements. But if it's not, then you need to either have two separate food safety plans, one that has Codex, one that goes through the preventive controls, or you can combine the two that both have Codex and the preventive controls in there. So with the preventive controls, they do talk about the 5 steps of HACCP, and then the 7 principles, which are pretty much entwined in the preventive controls. But those 5 steps are all optional. You know, it's an option. It's not mandated. But if you follow those 5 steps, then you should be following those requirements within Codex. So that's really the short answer is you can have 2 separate plans, but it's not a requirement within the SQF. We're just asking that your written food safety plan follow the methodology outlined in Codex. We added in Approved Supplier Program a component for food fraud. This was a requirement through GFSI. Food fraud is added in 2 areas within the code as how it's addressed within GFSI. So within food fraud within the supplier program, the site has to conduct a vulnerability assessment that's evaluating the suppliers coming into the site, looking at known vulnerabilities, whether it's the ingredients that you're using or the source of the ingredient or potentially the economic consequence of substitution. It could be a big gain if you want to substitute a different ingredient or higher protein levels or whatever it might be. So as it relates to the SQF Food Safety Code, food fraud only applies to food safety. So it's a limited scope if you're looking at food safety and you're looking at the vulnerabilities that's going to make the product economically adulterated but unsafe, and that's what it is. Quality is addressed in level 3. So food fraud for quality would be addressed in level 3, but in the quality code. But for food fraud for food safety, it's all in the manufacturing code and it's specific to food safety. So that's where this is looking at specifically the requirements of it approving a supplier and including vulnerability assessments for those suppliers and incorporating food fraud into that vulnerability assessment, and then mitigation procedures once identified. Environmental monitoring is new to Edition 8, or new to Module 2. It's not new to Edition 8. It was always a part of high-risk processes in Module 11. But what we were finding is sites that were potentially not deemed high risk were just exempting out of environmental monitoring. And we literally had recalls to sites that had Listeria, and in their audit, it was non-applicable. So what we did is we added it to Module 2 as a system element. It's not a mandatory element. It's not optionary either. You would have a risk assessment conducted to identify the scope of the environmental monitoring risks, and then how you are controlling those risks. So it would be via a risk assessment if you were to get non-applicable or exempt. But basically, when we asked experts who should have an environmental monitoring program, they said everybody should. Everybody should really look at the potential threats within your environmental monitoring program and understand what those threats are and put in policies and procedures and testing and protocol to address those threats. So again, not a mandatory component, but it does, it is in the system element, so that it has to be conducted. So here's the response type. 95% are compliant. We had about 3.5% minors, 1% major, and then 1% OIP, opportunity for improvement, and then less than 0.5% major and no criticals. Yet, when you look at the recall breakdown for our manufacturing sites in particular, 70% of all of our recalls, our biological recalls, are due to Listeria. So this is hopefully something that we can make a change in when we're addressing and preventing recalls, is really looking at robust environmental monitoring programs. 2.5 for system verification, again, a couple updates just to clarify some of these code requirements. So regarding corrective actions, it was more, what was there before was more about verification and not about what needs to be included for corrective actions. So it's really how corrective actions are determined, how they're implemented, and how they're verified. That's what we need to, what the auditor will be looking for, how that is being conducted, how corrective actions are being conducted so that they're not going to reoccur. Next is the, again, updated for system verification for resolution of nonconformities. So we wanted to clarify that we're looking at all of the nonconformities and its potential corrections or corrective actions that are there that need to be included. And then, again, looking at external laboratories, we wanted to include that we want the site's contract service specifications to be included, or when an external laboratory is used, that laboratory is listed in the site's contract service specification register. So we just wanted to clarify that. Edition 8, for 2.5, continuing with system verification. What we did in system verification under 255, and this is under internal audits, what we wanted to take a look at is the difference between internal audits and as well as looking at inspections. So we wanted to differentiate the requirements for internal audits versus inspections. So as you know, an inspection is just basically, could be a daily, monthly, weekly check. It's really just looking at the verification system, just seeing if things work the way that they should be working. Where the internal audit is an overall check of the SQF system. And so we wanted to differentiate these two because oftentimes manufacturers were just providing the auditors with a basic internal audit or a GMP check stating that that's their internal audit program, which it really is not that internal audit program. And then on top of it, what our emphasis is to ensure competence of the individuals that are performing these tasks. So it's not just those that are conducting internal audits or inspections, but it's also the basic competence of the employees themselves, the SQF practitioner, the HACCP team, whatever it might be, so that they have the right level of experience and competence to do the duties that are assigned to them. And that's one of the things and one of the emphasis that we're looking at SQF this year. So wanted to highlight that we updated to clarify the role of the internal audit versus the inspection, as well as emphasize that it's not just about training and going to a specific class, but it's really looking at the competency of that individual and how can they conduct their task. For identification, traceability, withdrawal, and recall, we added some, updated some language to clarify the expectation. We took this to our retailers. Our retailers, when it comes to recalls and withdrawals, this is one of their biggest headache. I mean, you talk to some of the larger retailers that are out there, they have 8 recalls a week. And each recall requires the same amount of attention that needs to be conducted. They are the point of the point between good product and bad product and how to pull that off the shelf. So there is a level of detail that they have to execute. And so what we're trying to do is understand how can we address these recalls from the retailer perspective. So we did add some detail regarding the traceability, regarding products and inputs. And we also clarified and updated that the traceability system is to be reviewed at least annually as part of the product recall and withdrawal review. So understanding those traceability of those ingredients as part of recall and withdrawal. So you can't just have a no-brainer withdrawal or recall, mock recall or withdrawal. Instead, you've got to make sure that traceability is included as part of that withdrawal and recall. For the withdrawal and recall, we wanted to emphasize that the mock recall, those records, that the role of the mock recall should be executed to its full extent, including that if there is the investigation of the root cause to understand, how to prevent it. Even though it's a mock recall, the exercise itself is in place so that it would be executed that way if a true recall did exist. For 2633, we wanted to make sure that testing included one back and one up, so it's all the way from the raw materials to the finished product. And then we did clarify in there regarding who shall be notified, and then actually included the email address. We're getting a good response rate, much better than when we first rolled this out with Edition 7, but we're seeing a slip in this, and we want to make sure that we're hearing from both our sites as well as our certification bodies when a recall occurs. And just to give you some background, it's not that we want to shout from the rooftop who had a recall and who didn't. This is all public information. So to clarify, it's when public notification is required. It's not when there's public information that needs to be shared. It's when public needs to be notified for health reasons. And that's, so it's all public information. So that's, put that aside. What we really want to understand is what's causing these recalls and how can we prevent future recalls from happening. So there is that element of being aware of these recalls so that we can act on it and gather information and share lessons learned or share reasons why. But again, confidential information is never shared with our sites. Food defense and food fraud. So the food defense, we added that it has to be challenged at least annually and that the records need to be maintained. For food fraud, again, this is from the site's perspective. So what I shared with you earlier was about incoming ingredients and your raw material suppliers. This is regarding the site's act and vulnerabilities for food fraud. Oftentimes this is changing code dates or substitution or whatever it might be, or whatever it might be as it relates to food safety. So again, so if it's just the food safety code, it is only food safety that we're looking at. But the site has to conduct a vulnerability assessment that would identify potential economic adulteration points and then implementing mitigation procedures. So this is specific to the site. So there's two components to food fraud. One is at the supplier level, two is at the site level. So just to kind of understand what's food fraud versus food defense, there's so many different types of resources out there that there's a lot that would be available. Again, this is something that GFSI has imposed that we have to put forth and see what's out there. We don't know what we don't know when it comes to food fraud. We haven't really looked for it that much. And so I think what we need to do is sit back and see what kind of opportunities are out there, what kind of threats are actually out there. So for the food defense, it's always looking at a threat assessment versus the food fraud, which is looking at vulnerabilities and understanding where those potential threats for vulnerabilities are, whether it's protein substitution or looking again at susceptible ingredients like spices or like flavorings or whatever it might be that you would use in your manufacturing of feed or pet food. Again, mitigation strategies are always going to be identified, monitoring and corrective actions, food defense verification and records. So there are very much similarities, but bottom line with food fraud, you're identifying the vulnerability, understanding what that impact may be, looking at it from different perspectives, origin or susceptible ingredients, or the potential threat for what the impact is for economic adulteration. So like I said, there's tons of sources for information. These are about 4 that we identified as it relates to food fraud. We get a request, about what we were looking for in a vulnerability assessment, and We haven't really put together anything like that, and I don't know if we will. I'll be honest, it's every time we put together a white paper or guidance, that's the only thing that everybody refers to, and we end up having robot auditors and robot sites. And what we need is for sites and auditors to evaluate their own potential threats and risks and put in their own mitigation plan, and have the auditor assess against that. So for food defense, FSMA has a good resource. They have actually a food defense plan that you can download, the plan builder that you can download. They have mitigation strategies and scenarios, and then there's the PASS 96 guidance. So PASS is a publicly available standard, and PASS 96 talks about food defense and food fraud. For food fraud, the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, USP. So oftentimes you have to pay for this stuff under the USP. They have excellent stuff, excellent resources, and good strategies. So they would be a good resource to tap into. Michigan State, all that is free. So auditor training as well as site training. So there's webinars that Dr. John Spinks does, and I think that they do a lot of good stuff and research. And then the PASS document that's available for food fraud and food defense. And then PwC and SSafe are also good, good resources as well. So here are some things, it's an infographic that we saw that USP shared at one of their conferences, and looking at potential threats, what are some of those commonly adulterated foods, economically adulterated foods that you could take a look at and see if maybe that's in, your approved supplier program. So allergen management, again, this is probably the top question that I get, and I kind of want to walk everybody and see exactly what our requirements are. So for pet food, 2821, it is a mandatory requirement. But basically, it's nothing that you haven't been doing already if you're already SQF. What you were never automatically exempted out, or you shouldn't have been automatically exempted out and given an NA, because I understand from a regulatory perspective, there isn't a regulatory requirement for allergens. What we're asking is that pet food facilities conduct a risk analysis for those food allergens for intended or unintended to meet your customer or regulatory requirement. And that there's an assessment even for workplace-related allergens if needed. If it's not applicable, then you would be looking at it from, that you don't have any allergens or potential threats or whatever within the locker rooms or lunchroom, et cetera. If there's allergens available by staff, and how this is incorporated into the food safety plan, how addressing allergen management is in the food safety plan. So basically, it's requiring that risk assessment that you've already been doing, and you've already been doing that for 7.2. We didn't ask anything. All we're saying is that for pet food, it's mandatory now, and there has to be a review of that risk assessment conducted by the auditor. For feed, we did include a component for allergen management. However, it's not mandatory. And number two, it's only if there are regulatory requirements or customer requirements that needs to be mandated for labeling requirements. And that's really what it is. And then it has specific requirements in place that you would be following the risk assessment, assessment of the workplace-related food allergens, accessibility by your staff, as well as incorporated into the food safety plan. So yes. Okay, so a couple questions came in. Number one was regarding the presentation materials. Absolutely. We will send it out to everybody, a PDF version, because the PowerPoint gets to be too big. So yes, all that will be sent out to everybody who registered. And then another question is regarding, does SQF require a surface protein testing as part of the allergen program? We would require if you have an allergen program, we're not requiring it. It depends on the allergen management program that you have identified. So if you are looking at validation, then it would have to be some type of test that is going to test for that particular allergen, whether it's peanut, whether it's wheat, or anything that you would be looking at. So it's a specific test to measure the allergen that you are trying to prevent cross-contact with. Another question came in and said, we can say we assessed it, but there are no regulatory requirements. What are the allergens for cats, dogs, et cetera? So that's a good question, and I'm not an expert on cats and dogs. I do have 2 dogs, and I wouldn't want them to get sick, but I'm not an expert on what those allergens are. That's what your risk assessment would do. So you're saying you can't just say there's no regulatory requirement, therefore I don't have to do this. What we're asking pet food operations to do is take a look at their customer requirement, take a look at what their allergens are as a threat to the intended population, which would be dogs and cats and pet food, pets in general, as well as unintended, which could potentially be humans. And again, you could assess and incorporate those regulatory requirements to say, basically, this is how we manage it. You know, it's declared on our label, and this is what we do in order to manage these allergens. It's not saying you have to follow a particular regulatory requirement, but we're asking that you take a look at how allergens are treated in your facility and how they could be managed in order to prevent any type of incident from occurring that you're trying to manage. And it could, again, be the intended as well as the unintended, knowing that there are specific allergens for either one. We produce for 10 species of animals in the same facility. There are no regulatory allergen requirements as far as I know. And I understand that there are no regulatory requirements for allergens. But again, what we're looking at is how would you conduct that risk assessment to identify potential allergen threats in your operation. Is there any known allergens for animal foods, or are you referring to allergens for human foods? I believe there are specific foods that pets can't eat. I know dogs, for example, that I know, like walnuts or specifically, and I don't know if that would be toxic and added, it probably wouldn't be added into your allergen management program, but, you know, I don't know if there would be particular, you know, corn or gluten or whatever it might be within there. Again, looking at how you would assess potential threats to allergens and what you could do in order to prevent cross-contact on that. More information about environmental monitoring program for animal feed. Preventive controls for microbiologicals may not be recorded for SPSMA. It's true. I mean, you might not have any type of environmental monitoring program. Again, doing a risk assessment as to what those potential threats are. So it's not just, it's how you're manufacturing the food and how the feed and how that feed is going to be distributed at that next level. So it's not a mandatory element, environmental monitoring is, but what we're asking is that the site does conduct some type of risk assessment to determine what that level of threats are for environmental monitoring, evaluating what you're using the feed, and again, to that next level. Is there a threat to the animal safety, human safety, whatever it might be, and that's what you have to look at. Okay, so that's really the changes in the system elements. Now I'm going to go into Module 3 and then Module 4. Basic 3 and 4 are pretty much the same, so I might just highlight those changes in 4, understanding that the changes in 3 would be applicable to 4 as well. Okay, so for Module 3, I'm grouping them out not just in elements, but really in overall headings. So pest control, we clarified that it's poison rodenticide bait rather than just poison bait, because pheromone traps or, mostly pheromone traps or those fly sticky things, people were getting a lot of questions on that. So basically we don't want poison bait stations to be used inside for rats or mice inside the operation. We changed pest management to pest prevention. It just seemed to fit better because you're not trying to manage the pests once they come into your facilities, but really the intent is to prevent them from getting there in the first place. We added two new requirements. If there's pest activity in the operation, that it's not posing a risk to the finished product or any type of threat to the product. So understanding that there probably is going to be pest activity, flies, insects, whatever it might be, but there is no posing of a risk to the product. And then we also added new elements on the records and the disposal, the investigation, and the resolution of any of that pest activity and what was conducted in order to prevent it from happening again. For equipment cleaning and sanitation, we added conditions for extractor fans if they're used. Again, not requiring extractor fans, but if they're used, there's conditions as to how they're cleaned, where they're located, and not posing a threat to the product. We added specifications for equipment and utensils and protective clothing new to the facility. We were getting a lot of questions as to the types of frocks we can order or utensils that they can use or what kind of equipment specifications should be. And what we're stating is now that the site has to identify what this is. Refurbished equipment, for example, sometimes it's not the right piece of equipment for the operation, and we wanted to make sure that the right people were a part of the decision-making process. So plant management or maintenance often finds a good piece of used equipment and they're going to plop it in the middle of the production facility, and then QA and everybody else has to figure out how to clean it, how to run it, how to check it, what it does, and it probably isn't the right fit for the operation. So we wanted to add that specifications for the purchasing of this equipment that's new to the facility is identified. We added and clarified the element regarding temporary repairs. We know that temporary repairs do happen, but we want them to be temporary, and so we're requiring that they be removed on a timely basis as well as not pose a risk to the product. Pre-op, we say that if maintenance does any type of work on the line, that there is a pre-operational inspection. You guys are probably already doing that, but we wanted to put that in the code. And that pre-operational inspections are to be conducted if they exist. So we're not, again, mandating pre-op be conducted. We're just saying if they exist, that pre-op by the relevant person has to be conducted. And those inspections are conducted on essential areas at a defined frequency, so wherever it might be, but the laundry, not the laundry room, but the bathrooms or break rooms, etc. We added detergents and sanitizers are labeled according to regulatory requirements, and we also added a new requirement for detergent mix concentration. So those are all added to sanitation, and that's been added to Module 3. For personnel, we got rid of the first aid kit, but we added what does the site do in the risk of the change, or if there is any contamination, potential contamination through bodily fluids like vomiting or diarrhea, and we wanted to make sure that the risk had some type of plan in, or the site had some type of plan in place. Again, we wanted to make sure that there's a risk analysis to ensure the clothing and hair policy that's in place is in place to prevent unintentional microbiological or physical contamination. When it comes to visitors, the request is that they are either escorted or trained on the site's food safety policies. Toilets, we wanted to include an area for hanging frocks or other outer garments if needed. Again, we're not requiring that outer garments are used, but if there are used to protect the food from the personnel, that there is a place for them to be housed outside the toilet areas. And then we added provisions for outside eating areas, that they're maintained and cleaned and tidy. Water and air quality, we now included other gases in compressed air. So now it's not just air, compressed air, but other gases like nitrogen flushes, etc. Compressed air systems, it's not just about microbiological purity, which we found out, but it's about basically any applicable food safety hazards. It could be contamination through gases, actually, which would be one of the bigger concerns, or physical contamination as well. So Module 3 also includes new requirements for storage and handling, and now an entire plan is now required. It's 3611, and basically what 3611 is looking at is the conditions of the storage area in order to minimize any types of threats to the product. So we were always just focused on like dry storage and the floor, conditions of the floors, but we weren't ever focused on the product that was in that area, and so we added a requirement in there. We looked at how the vehicles are secured during transport, and then also the disposal of trademarked material. So if you're making product on behalf of one of your customers to their specific trademarked ingredients, spices, the special, not spices, but season blends or ingredients, anything that you're using that's specific to that customer, how is that being disposed of? It could be packaged materials, etc. So for Module 4, it's similar to those changes in Module 3. I'm going to go over them quickly, but I'll highlight some of those that are actually different. So again, pest management is basically the same, where we looked at those new added requirements and the clarification of rodenticide bait. For personnel, there was a change including how snap-off blades aren't to be used in manufacturing or storage areas. The specifications for equipment is still in there. The clarification of pipes that are carrying sanitary waste or water can't be directly over product lines or storage areas. We did include a new requirement in there for CIP equipment, and there's requirements, specific requirements as to how CIP equipment is maintained, and the other areas that are being conducted. So for Module 4 and personnel, again, removed the reference to first aid stations and then added bodily fluids. We also added that drinking of water in production is allowed as long as there's no risk to the product or process. So all that is in there as well. Before I move on, let's just see what kind of questions are in there. Okay, let me go up a little bit. Yeah, because I saw some questions coming in. I just kept plugging away, so hang on. So we list so back to allergens, we list our raw ingredients as a known allergen, advised according to the BOL documentation, fish specifically. So again, if that's what your allergen management program would be, then that's what you would be demonstrating control over with. So if you're listing it within your label ingredients or something like that, then that would be fine. You know, that's how you are identifying your allergen labeling control program. The difference between Module 3 and 4 is basically the end product. So Module 3 is specific to feed. Module 4 is specific to pet food. And there are processing, basically the differences is in the processing requirements. So how processing is being conducted within the feed versus the pet food. Are both required for animal food manufacturing? It depends on what your finished product is on the certificate. So if you're making pet food for domestic animals, then that's what your focus would be. If you're making feed for animal consumption, then that would be what you would have to have on there. So you could be Modules 3 and 4, and it would be a blended audit that would identify what those differences are. You wouldn't have to do 3 and 4, but they would be a combined and eliminate those duplications in a combined audit. Okay, let me go back. A couple more questions. Is there a defined list of species between animal food and animal feed? I don't have that defined list of species between animal food and animal feed. Let me get with AFIA and see if I can't come up with something specific about that. I don't have a specific defined list. All really good questions, you guys. I appreciate that. Okay, so we're running just a little bit over, but I just want to let you know it'll probably be about another 15 minutes. So I'm going to finish off Module 4. I'm going to talk about the quality code, and then we can wrap things up. But keep chatting in your questions. I'll answer them as they come in. So continuing on with personnel, the same provisions apply for feed. We're looking at, again, how maintenance of bodily fluids. We are allowing drinking of water in production, so auditors were really good when it said no eating, drinking, smoking, spitting, chewing, and water just seemed to be part of that. And even though water, as long as there's no risk to the production, it's allowable within the manufacturing facility. Water and air, similar to feed. The one difference is that we're looking at adequate storage facilities for any water that's stored on site, and specifically as ice used as an ingredient or a processing aid must comply with all of those set microbiological procedures, and that the same as for the storage requirements. Storage and handling, basically the same, except there is a requirement. So pet food has a separate component for high-risk processes, so any process that is high risk, and there is a dedicated staff to that particular function within the process. So that's just within pet food. Okay, so Edition 8 timeline, as you all know, that has been implemented as of January 2nd. So Edition 8 has been implemented and will be executed throughout until the next edition comes out. If you had a surveillance audit under Edition 7.2, even if it's in 2018, it will still be under 7.2. So specifically, it's fully implemented except for those surveillance audits. If you had a surveillance audit for whatever reason, it will be to the edition of the code that you were audited against. There is a lot of information that's out there, tons of information. We, released Edition 8, we had webinars, we have guidance documents. We haven't anything specific for feed and pet food. We are working with AFIA to identify and determine actually if you guys need your own system elements even. So we're working with AFIA and seeing do feed and pet food need their own code, literally their own code, their own system elements that speak more specifically to the feed and pet food industry. So I still don't think we got it perfect. I think we improved the relevance. However, it probably isn't still a perfect match. So that's something that we're working with AFIA on and really identifying if there's something that we need to do for feed, specifically for feed and pet food. So we'll get back to you on that. I'm sure there's no other questions. No? Okay. The other thing that I wanted to highlight actually is our newsletter. So if you're not on our newsletter, or if you ignore our newsletter, this is really where we're housing all of our updates, all of our communication to our stakeholder groups. So it has industry updates, trends, recalls, or issues that we're seeing, emerging issues, or regulatory updates. It lists where all of our training opportunities are, if we have any featured webinars, tools and resources that are available. We highlight one particular SQF supplier in all different industry scopes, so feed, pet food, manufacturing, storage and distribution, etc. And then it also gives all the SQF contact information. Okay, so let's go over the quality code real quick. The quality code, this was formerly level 3, now it's its own code. One of the things with the quality code is that you need to have an SQF certification. If you don't have an SQF certification, then you are not eligible to have an SQF quality code certification. So it can be audited in conjunction with that food safety certification or separate from the food safety certification. However, the prerequisite before you get a quality code certificate, you need to have a food safety code certificate. The good thing about separating out the quality code is that we don't have to follow the Part A requirements under the manufacturing code for the food safety code for manufacturing. So it's a pass, not pass. It's not a scored or rated audit. So it's as long as you close out all of your nonconformities, you basically get a certificate. There wouldn't be, you wouldn't have to have a score or rating. It doesn't affect your food safety score. It is completely separate from that aspect. We do have quality training that's available either through our training centers or through online, and we have specific qualifications for auditors to conduct these audits. The Quality Shield is still available. Nothing has really changed in that point. So the outline of the Quality Code is only the Part A in the system elements. So system elements are built off of the food safety system elements. There aren't any GAPs or GMPs that need to be followed in association with the Quality Code. It's the relevancy of those GMPs and GAPs in the modules, either, when you're looking at Module 3 or Module 4 within the SQF Food Safety Code. But the system elements is where the focus of the quality system is. So Part A, like I said, the prerequisite is that you have to have some type of food safety certification. It also designates an SQF quality practitioner, similar to the food safety practitioner, probably would be the same person, can be separate, but probably the same person. Again, what we're asking is that that site have the required competencies to carry out the functions as it relates to their SQF quality practitioner. One of the other things with the quality practitioner is that there's a heavy emphasis on statistical process control, or SPC, or any other tools, whether it's statistical or automated. There's APC, which is automated process control. So if there's other quality tools that the site is using to reduce process variation and drive a root cause analysis of those nonconformities. So that's what we're asking the SQF practitioner be competent in, whether it's SPC or APC or other tools that are reducing process variation. We want that quality practitioner to have an understanding of that. Different from the Food Safety Code is that we don't have food nonconformities. Instead, they're deviations. And just as a side note, there is no critical deviations raised at a quality systems audit. They're only minor and major deviations. So even though there is no score or rating, there is a surveillance audit based off the type and number of nonconformities. So if you have more than 10 minors or more than 2 majors raised at the certification or recertification audit, then the site is subject to a surveillance audit that would be conducted in 6 months. So it would only be to the Quality Code. However, if the auditor does see a significant food safety risk, that would be raised during the quality audit for corrective action, root cause, etc. Couple questions came in. One question came in specifically. Does the same SQF Quality Code apply to all categories? Yes, it does. So the SQF Code is specific. It applies to the food safety codes for manufacturing, storage and distribution, food packaging, and primary. It does not apply to retail. It's not applicable at retail, but yes, since it's based off the system elements, it's specific to those system elements. And then somebody else came in and asked, when do you think the next edition will be launched? I will say, you're the first person that is actually asked when you think the next edition will be launched. You must know SQF. So you say 2 to 5 years. I might say 1 to 2 years. Simply, it would be a very soft edition. So 8.1 would be released that just clarifies some of the code requirements that we've had questions on. So questions, especially in the Quality Code, there was one in particular, but there are some elements that we thought were clear when we wrote the code, but it just needs some clarification. And as you know, with document control, any change in the code would require us to reversion it. So there's some formatting and editing and changes that will need to be made. So an 8.1 is probably going to be released within the year, but it would be a very soft change that I'm anticipating. As far as another full edition, like edition 9, that's when we would comply with GFSI updates into a new benchmarking requirements. Right now they're on version 7, so when they go to version 8, we'll probably have a new code released. which my anticipation would be about 3 to 4 years. That clarifies it. Oh, here's some key changes to the quality code. Again, the requirement for the SQF quality practitioner is in there. We are looking for a quality communication program. That communication program, kind of think of it as your own internal marketing for quality. How are you getting the employees, the staff, understanding what the quality component is of your plan? It could be huddles, it could be posters, it could be meeting breaks or whatever it might be, but how are you communicating quality to your staff? There's a benchmarking of quality performance, so what are those known parameters and how is the site benchmarking against those parameters to measure quality performance? A requirement to resolve as well as identify the quality complaints, so quality complaints are now pulled out, not just food safety complaints, but quality complaints. Customer contact in the event of a crisis that affects supply. So this is when you are going to have to short a customer, and how are you communicating that back to the customer. The systems manual, the quality system manual, is looking at SPC or, like I said, APC, automated process control, or other applicable quality tools within your operation. The commercial realization, when you're looking at product development, has to include those quality considerations now when you're looking at product development and all the way to commercial realization. Validation of product formulation and manufacturing processes, now that has been included for specification and product development. That's been called out for quality. In the continue on, contract manufacturers are now included as part of quality. Those finished product specifications now include service quality requirements. So before we're looking at product, so when the new ISO guide came out, 17065, that's product certification. The new ISO guide now includes product and service. So we incorporated that into this quality code. So the finished product specifications now can include service, meaning short orders to customers or delays in delivery delays, whatever it might be, but service is now included as part of the specification requirements. Review of customer requirements and those expectations and how is that being managed and communicated and implemented within the specifications. Storage and transportation emphasizes minimizing loss, waste, or damage. Again, those quality complaints focused on service as well as product. Still include the threat assessment using that HACCP approach for quality. So looking at what are the threats to quality, the threats to the business, and understanding what those potential threats could be and putting in place control points or quality control points, as we like to call them, or critical quality points, that we like to call them. Detailed requirements for the food plan per those Codex 12 steps. So again, HACCP following Codex, but HACCP for quality. SPC or APC methods to optimize production processes, reducing process variation. And now food prod, like I said, includes those quality parameters. So that's about it. Let me see, there's a couple questions that are out there. Is SQF planning to come up with a code that is 100% compliant with FDA regulations? You know, I don't know. I have to look and see what we're missing to understand if we could do that. But keep in mind that we're a global program. So whatever we design, it has to be addressed globally. So we have feed and pet food suppliers in those 5 major countries that I talked about, and we need to make sure that we're making a code that fits GFSI, that fits all of our stakeholder groups. So for us to tailor a code to one particular regulatory requirement would mean we're looking at FDA, we would be looking at Australia, Mexico, Canada, and Japan's food safety regulations, and we'd have a code thicker than what it is right now. So again, we'd have to look and see what actually we're missing and if we need to add it or if it would be better to be added as a guidance. So that's a great question. All righty. I don't see any other questions that are out there. hope to see you at our international conference that's in Atlanta, Georgia, October 23rd through the 25th of this year. I know registration will be ready within the next month or so, and we'll send out an email to all of our stakeholder groups, so hopefully we can see you there. Often we have a Safe Feed, Safe Food training course that we like to offer, but sometimes we just don't get the attendance. So hopefully, you know, if we offer it, you guys can come as well. So questions, again, you'll get a copy of this edition. You'll get a copy of this edition or this presentation that would include all of our email addresses. If you can't figure out how to spell or remember Jeanette's last name, one thing to do is just info@sqfi.com, and we'll for sure get that email. So don't have to worry about figuring out how to spell or pronounce any of our last names, because we are one blended crew, aren't we? So info@sqfi.com. All righty, so thanks to you guys for participating on the webinar. Again, you have all of our contact information. We'd be happy to hear from you, and we'll be working with AFIA a little bit more closely this year, and so we'll be able to hopefully partner and do more things for the feed and pet food industry. So thanks again for your support, and I appreciate all you do for SQF and for food safety. Bye-bye.